Part 2 of this series of the critique of pure polemic shall focus on selective readings of history by different factions and different groups. Now, what is common to see in many polemics is that there's a very biased and simplistic reading of the history of their opponents or opposing ideologies. They will attribute all kinds of heinous crimes and heinous acts of oppression and repression to their opponents. Meanwhile, they will downplay acts of oppression that their own side have committed, or they will outright deny them. This is common both in religious circles as well as in political circles. This tendency to exaggeration, so to speak, comes from the fact that people are inclined towards exaggeration and giving grand numbers. As the famous medieval Islamic historian Ibn Khaldun suggested, that exaggeration is easy upon the tongue and people naturally tend towards boasting about large numbers and large figures. What this entails then is that many a time opponents or opposing ideologies are accused of things which they may have indeed done, but they may be exaggerated. At the same time, others or themselves, when their own side commits those same crimes, they downplay it or outright deny it. This isn't me preferring one side over the other or defending one side over the other, because everybody and everyone is guilty of this to a certain extent. Dr. Carroll Quigley, for example, in his book Tragedy and Hope, he outlines the various civilizations of the world, and he talks about the crimes and oppression committed by all kinds of groups, whether they be the Nazis or the communists or the liberal capitalists or Western colonialism or any of the other civilizations. In reality, everybody has persecuted and been the persecuted at different points of history. Thus, it would be unfair to deny the victimhood of certain groups at certain periods of time, and at the same time to deny the fact that one side themselves has also done a lot of oppression. What tends to happen is that people focus on historical events in order to deny the important and major suffering of people in the world in the present. For example, people may use the suffering of Jewish people to deny or unlegitimate, so to speak, the suffering of the Palestinian people, where any criticism of Israel's genocidal and maniacal actions in the Gaza Strip is labeled as anti-Semitic, because somehow criticizing the fact that Palestinian babies are starving due to Israeli actions is somehow the same as basically denying all of Jewish oppression throughout history somehow. People, unfortunately, in the Western world and the Western establishment tends to ignore the suffering of people throughout the world. We see the immense suffering that people around the world have gone through, and we become so desensitized to it. And the issue that often occurs is that people use past history to deny or downplay those current crimes. Everybody is guilty of this to a certain extent, and by no means is of mine, somehow supporting or saying that perhaps both sides are equal, but we should still contextualize what both the sides are trying to say and understand them in light of a nuanced reading of history. For example, the Israel-Palestine issue, or the Palestinian sort of suffering that's occurring right now, is an important aspect to understand this, because if we want to decontextualize the Palestinians fighting and their cause, then surely why would we not also decontextualize why would that not also lead to a historical reading which would decontextualize and delegitimize the suffering of the Jewish people as well? If we're gonna avoid using a time frame of, let's say, 75 years to understand the Palestinian struggle, then what's stopping us from not using or not employing a longer time frame to try and delegitimize or devalue the suffering of the Jewish people? Dr. Carol Quigley once again did discuss, for example, the suffering that people have gone through under communism and fascism. It's ironic for secularists and atheists to say that religious people have caused much suffering over the past centuries and that religion has caused wars and violence, when in reality it is the secular ideologies which have perhaps killed the most amount of people. Secular ideologies have killed far more people than religious causes have. At the same time, it's important to note that religious eras or eras of history which were characterized by religiosity, these eras were not necessarily golden ages of peace and humanity. There was much good in them, but there was also a lot of bad and evil things that occurred. The various wars between different civilizations come to mind. For example, the Crusades, or the, let's say, whether it be the Barbary pirates or the Crusades. There have been cases where both sides of a religious conflict have indeed caused suffering and have oppressed each other. Especially in religious circles, let's say, Muslims may accuse Jews or Christians of causing much suffering. Jews may accuse Christians and Muslims of causing much suffering. Christians may accuse Jews and Muslims of causing much suffering. But the reality is that all of them have done things in the past which are very problematic. That isn't necessarily a reflection of their religion or ideologies. It's just a reflection of the fact that they are all human beings who have committed bad and committed good. The same goes for these secular ideologies, because ultimately, the people from these various ideologies and various religions were, in most cases, good people who sought to bring about change in this world. But even if we were to say that the theory of their ideology in and of itself was perhaps perfect and pure, human application is always imperfect and it has to be applied in an imperfect world. Thus, even if in theory these ideologies are perfect and sound and they may bring about utopia, in reality they will be imperfect when applied, for they are applied by imperfect people in an imperfect society, in an imperfect world, in an imperfect context. Thus, it would be unfair to criticize Christians, for example, for the wars of religion or sectarian troubles and persecution, especially if perhaps secularists would ignore the own civil strifes that have occurred in their lands. For example, Marxists may make a point of criticizing theocracies, and especially religion as the opium of the masses, but first of all, they've killed far more people than any other ideology has. And second of all, the kind of civil strife and the kind of purging and killing of other leftists who didn't agree with the party line was very common in these countries. To be completely fair here, Marxists would say that the Soviet Union or all these other countries perhaps weren't real socialism or real communism. But that perhaps begs the question that if your ideology can't be applied in a real world context, then how could it be viable at all? To be fair, of course, they would not agree with these atrocities and they would absolutely condemn them, but then they would say that a real socialist society would ultimately be a utopia. Of course, whilst they don't accept these tyrannies, to be fair to them, the question does remain as to how socialism can be viable in real world conditions. So we can see that whilst these ideologies whilst these ideologies and these religions and these various political systems have tried to bring about good in this world, they have committed bad as well. And we should have a nuanced reading of history and accept the good and bad of all ideologies, rather than taking a very selective and biased reading of them.